Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Part 26. Swords and Fire. In the 175th year of the Common Reckoning, Brisos, the ruler of Midhaven, was slain by the Orcs at the Battle of Collium. Midhaven fell. Many Dogopolitan refugees fled to Cadamos. Balios, the son of Brisos, was now the leader of the Dogopolitans. In the 176th year of the Common Reckoning, he assembled his exiled people, and he spoke to them as follows. For nearly 50 years, since Dogopolis fell, we have fought against Orcan aggression. My grandfather died trying to reclaim the lands he had lost. My father died defending the little left to us. Now we have lost even that. The Orcs have taken all of the lands of the Dogopolitans. And how can we continue as a people with no land to call our own, to tend and to till and to pass down to our children? You may feel that you are safe from the Orcs here at Cadamos. That may be the case. It may be not. Even so, you may wish to remain here, in peace, at least for the moment, and throw your lot in with the Cadamosians. After all, these people are kin to us. We already speak their tongue and follow the same customs. Their settlement is yet young, and there is plenty of land for all. Many of you may find that attractive, and I will not prevent anyone from making that choice. But even if the Orcs do not follow you here, the price you will pay is that you will no longer be Dogopolitans, but Cadamosians. That is not a price I am prepared to pay. I was born a Dogopolitan. I have fought to defend the lands of the Dogopolitans. I have become the ruler of the Dogopolitans, and I will die a Dogopolitan. I will fight the Orcs to recover what we have lost, and I will win it all or win nothing at all. At Midhaven we clung on to what scraps of land still remained to us. I will not squabble with the Orcs over scraps. I will march upon Dogopolis and reclaim my patrimony, or I will die in the attempt. Will you march with me or no? The Dogopolitans cheered wildly and promised that they would follow Balios wherever he might choose to lead them. Balios took considerable comfort from this reaction and mentioned as much to his wife Brithiva after the gathering had dispersed. But Brithiva warned her husband that the spell cast by his eloquence would disperse along with the crowd. It was one thing to join the applause for a noble sentiment expressed in stirring rhetoric. It was quite another to strap on armour and march to war against a feared and ferocious foe. And so it proved. Balios now faced the practicalities of his proposed campaign. The Orcan onslaught that had overwhelmed the Dogopolitans had been swift and brutal. Those that had fled considered themselves lucky to have escaped with the clothes on their backs and maybe a small bundle of valuables. Balios had not only to raise an army, but he had to equip it. And then he had to consider how to provision it on the long march to Dogopolis. Spring turned into summer, and summer turned into autumn, and then it was winter, and still things were not ready. Meanwhile, the Dogopolitans had to live. They built homes to dwell in and cleared land to cultivate, and, as they became increasingly committed to their new lives, many of them quietly abandoned any intention of going to war. And then, in the spring of the 177th year of the Common Reckoning, Arnor marched a dwarvish army down the great river to Cadamos and announced that he had come to fight the Orcs alongside Balios. This caused much excitement, particularly among the Cadamosians. They had seen the havoc that the spear dwarves of Unnascrag had inflicted upon the new Lixians at the Battle of the Groves. The general view in Cadamos had been that Balios' planned attack on the orcs was a last desperate throw of the dice that had little chance of success. Now that view began to change. Maybe with the assistance of the dwarves, the Dogopolitans might just win the victory. Indeed, a number of Cadamosians even went so far as to join the ranks of Balios' host, and this in turn convinced a number of the previously wavering Dogopolitans to step forward. Although Brithava had been born in New Lixia and brought up in Midhaven, she was a Skelding princess. Her mother was the exiled Queen Adni, the widow of King Gudnaf. Adni had taught her daughter the family history, and Brithava knew how the dwarf Orm had attacked and burnt Overwater, provoking a bloody war. She had learnt how her grandfather, Godric, had won a great victory at the Battle of Absley, where Orm had been slain. Arnor boasted that he was the great-grandson of Orm. Brithava did not like or trust dwarves in general, and she had particular misgivings regarding Arnor, but she kept her thoughts to herself. Balios had no such misgivings. His preparations for war had finally been completed. The enthusiasm generated by Arnor's arrival had enabled him to replenish the dwindling ranks of his army. Now was the time to strike. He marched on Dogopolis. Balios did not gain the surprise that he had hoped for. When he emerged from the forest and stepped onto the fertile pastures surrounding Dogopolis, he found an army of armoured orcs awaiting him. Hastily, Balios formed a defensive line, which was battered by wave after wave of increasingly ferocious Orcan assaults. And when it seemed the line might break, Balios was at the forefront of the fighting, exchanging blows with his foes, inspiring those around him to hold firm. Arnor's spear dwarves proved their worth and won much glory, and ultimately, after much bloodshed, the battle was won and the orcs fled. Thus it was that, some 49 years after its fall, the Dogopolitans were able to recapture Dogopolis. The city had not fared well over that period. Initially, it had been comprehensively looted by the Orcan invaders. Then it had been the scene of perpetual strife as rival Orcan warbands struggled for control. What had once been a wealthy city of elegant townhouses and wide boulevards was now a ramshackle collection of half-ruined buildings and rudely constructed shanties, populated by half-clad and half-starved slaves abandoned by their Orcan masters. For the orcs had fled the city, taking whatever remained of the wealth of Dogopolis, including those of the enslaved population that were considered valuable to their masters. Those remaining in the city were the elderly, the infirm, the weak, and the unskilled. The situation in the countryside was somewhat better. Here were the estates of the Orcan warlords, farmed by slave labour. The departing orcs had cleared many of the storerooms and driven the livestock before them, but there were still crops in the fields, and not all of the granaries had been emptied. Brysos busied himself organising food supplies, both for his troops and for his newly recovered subjects. There was much rebuilding to do, and he made a start at this, although to complete it would be a work of many years. But he was also on his guard, maintaining his people in arms and watching the frontier, particularly to the west, expecting at any moment to be attacked by Gutnag, the Orcan warlord who now ruled at Midhaven. But Brysos' expectation was not fulfilled. Gutnag had spent the last 2 years thoroughly looting Midhaven. He was looking for new sources of plunder, but he had no interest in recapturing Dogopolis. There was no profit in that. His ambition was to sack New Lixia. And Gutnag felt that now was the time to make that ambition a reality. Many of the orcs fleeing Dorgopolis had travelled to Midhaven. One way or another, these newcomers had submitted to Gutnag's leadership. He was as strong as he was ever likely to be, and so he struck west. Lysonos was the king of New Lixia. He was not altogether unprepared for the Orcan invasion that he now faced. After all, since the fall of Midhaven, the orcs had been on his eastern frontier, and he knew enough about orcs to expect trouble from that quarter. Small groups of New Lixian militia regularly patrolled the range of hills known as the Heaps, alert for any Orcan incursion. Thus it was that Lysonos received early news of the orcs' approach. Lysonos had expected that the orcs would most likely start with a series of quick raids, learning the lie of the land and looking for easy pickings, withdrawing swiftly before any coherent resistance could be organised. He had prepared for this eventuality, making arrangements enabling him to quickly raise relatively small and mobile defensive forces at need. But the reports he was receiving made it clear that this was no raid. He was facing a substantial army, and the orcs were not spreading across the countryside, taking their time, robbing and looting, where he might be able to attack them in small groups. They were disciplined and focused, marching as a body rapidly and directly toward the city. Lysonos' preparations worked as he had intended, but in these circumstances this was of little use. Each of his defence forces was gathered quickly, but not as quickly as the orcs were advancing. By the time each New Lixian group had gathered, the orcs had long passed by. And even when this was not the case, what could a small band of defenders achieve against an entire Orcan host? Any meaningful resistance would require the various groups of New Lixians to coalesce into a larger force. But this would take time that Lysonos did not have. Lysonos did what he could. He called all of the citizens of New Lixia to arms and sent messengers across the land, summoning the rural population to his cause. He also sent messengers to Cadamos, asking that military assistance be sent as soon as possible. But Lysonos was a realist. In the limited time available, he could raise some sort of an army to fight the orcs, but whether it would be strong enough to defeat them was another matter. Maybe the best he could hope for was to delay and weaken the orcs, buying enough time for the Cadamosians to arrive. In that case, it was likely that the city would be sacked. The New Lixians had heard first-hand accounts of the brutal sack of Midhaven. Lysonos wanted to spare his people from such horrors, and so he advised the women and children and those men who were too infirm or aged to fight to evacuate the city. Thousands of refugees left New Lixia, heading up the Great River toward Cadamos. A few days later, in the evening, Lysonos received news that the orcs were only 15 miles away. The following morning, he marched all the troops that he had been able to gather out of the city to do battle with Gutnag, taking up a defensive position at Tintus Bridge. Gutnag committed his troops into the battle piecemeal, throwing attack after attack at Lysonos' position, gradually wearing the New Lixians down, and ultimately the orcs were able to force a passage across the bridge. But they paid a high price. The bridge was carpeted with their dead. Lysonos' army was less damaged. The brunt of the Orcan assault had fallen upon his heavy infantry, who suffered accordingly. But a hard core of heavy infantry remained to Lysonos, along with all of his light infantry, and reinforcements from the rural areas surrounding New Lixia continued to swell their numbers daily. Lysonos also received a message from Kratinos, the king of Cadamos, promising to bring an army rapidly to his assistance. Lysonos now made a controversial decision. He left New Lixia undefended, taking up a position to the north of the city. This had several advantages. New Lixia had no wall and was not provisioned for a siege. It was not at all clear he could defend it, and if he tried to, he might end up trapped and starving in the city. On the other hand, if he was outside the city and the orcs were within, he could easily provision his army from the rural areas and deny supplies to the orcs. He could prevent the orcs from pursuing and falling upon the slow-moving and undefended columns of refugees streaming north. He could quickly unite his forces with those arriving from Cadamos. The crucial disadvantage of his strategy was that it allowed the orcs to sack the now largely deserted city, and they did so. For 3 days, New Lixia was subject to a bestial orcan orgy of looting and destruction. It is said of Lysonos that he wept as, from a distance, he watched New Lixia burn.